put a smile on your face when you're moving from place to place. Good morning, good morning, morning, good morning, morning.
Welcome back, viewers, to the morning show on Tobago Updates Television. And of course, as we mentioned to you, we're going to be speaking with a former minority leader of the THA, Mr. Ashworth Jack. And we're talking about the Assembly Order of Speakers. As Julian mentioned earlier, there were some happenings in the House last week. And so we want to address some of those things and hear his perspective. So we're speaking with Mr. Ashworth Jack this morning. Good morning, Mr. Jack.
Good morning, and good morning, Channel 5. Thank you all for
Tobago
having me this morning.
Updates Television.
You see where I am this morning? I'm all over the place. Sorry, let me apologize. Good morning, Tobago Update. How could I make that error?
Right, so we are going to get straight on into the conversation this morning. We're talking about the order of speakers. What should happen? What has happened? And what should happen? What is your perspective on what took place? We saw the situation in the House last Thursday. We saw where, of course, the presiding officer was challenged. We saw where Assemblyman Duke had to be escorted out of the chamber. We want to know, what is your position where that is concerned? How was it handled? How was it handled in your perspective? And what do you think should have happened?
Well, the issue of order of speaker is something that there is no set pattern for, in that the only persons who are, for sure when they will speak is a mover of a motion or the person who answers a question, because the motion stands in their name. And as a result of the motion standing in the name, once the motion is called, then you expect that person to be the person who gets up to speak. The convention, as it goes from therein, is that every motion has someone who moves it and someone who responds. And one would expect the respondent of a motion to come from more than likely someone opposite. In the case of a minority motion needs a seconder. But a government motion doesn't. So once there's a minority motion, two people from the minority will get up, one after the other. One, the mover of the motion, will get up, speak on the motion, and then will take their seat, either when they're finished speaking or the expiration of their speaking time. The second person, who would be another member of the minority, because it needs a seconder, more than likely. If there's not, then a member of the majority can get up and second a motion, but then that person reserve their right to speak. If they did not reserve their right, then that person would once they say they get and speak, Madam Presiding Officer, in the case of the Tobago, I beg to second this motion. If they just sit down, that person would have been considered as already speaking. They would not be allowed to speak, or should not be allowed to speak later in the motion. I have seen it happen in the Tobago House of Assembly in the last 2 years or so, on a number of occasions, where the minority would have seconded a motion, sit down, and because of the inexperience, sometimes the presiding officer allowed them to speak again. But that should not be. Once you get up, you would have been considered as to have spoken. What have happened or transpired on Thursday is a bit different. There was an ongoing debate. There was a break. And immediately after the return from the break, then I think that the misunderstanding or the chaos started. In that, I think what the presiding officer recognized Assemblyman Clark as the first speaker in that session. And that is the right of the presiding officer. In that, all the presiding officer does is to look to see who catches her eyes. And that is a phrase that came from the old English system when there was no technology. And so what it means is that who the presiding officer sees indicates first they want to speak, then that the person speaks in that order. I would have looked at the thing, and so I kind of inquired a couple of things about it. And I, in the modern time, what happens? There's a knob in front of a button in front of you, in front of every speaker, and the person would depress that button to indicate I want to speak. There's a light on a panel in front of the presiding officer that will illuminate once that button is pressed. There's one for every speaker, every member of the House. And the presiding officer will then look at that and then indicate. Press that button for that speaker, which releases the mic that allows that person to join the debate. What transpired, or what we saw transpire on Thursday, is that the presiding officer would have recognized through pressing the button and indicating to the assemblyman clerk that he was to join the debate. The assemblyman Duke would have challenged that, saying, you didn't catch my eye. And the speaker said, well, no, I recognize Mr. Clark. And Assemblyman Duke continued to protest that he thought that he was being overlooked. And there are a number of questions that must be asked in this question, in this situation. One, did the assemblyman, and he did refer to the issue of the catching of the eye. Was it taken literally? Or did he indicate that he wished to speak by pressing the button? I don't wish to. My information is there was one light on, which was Assemblyman Clark's light. And therefore, the only person who would have legitimately been allowed to speak at that time would have been the person whose light was on. Now, if that is so, that was a simple matter to have solved. The maximum speaking time would have been about 40 minutes. And if the next speaker, in this case, Assemblyman Duke, wished to have spoken, all he needed to do was, indicate by pressing his button at that time. And it means that at the expiration of a maximum of 40 minutes, he would have been able to join the debate. But obviously, I think the assemblyman was aggrieved that he wasn't given that specific slot of speaking time.
So, we had a circumstance as well where it is Mr. Duke was indicating, and of course, these things go viral almost immediately, making the reference that to the presiding officer, you are not looking, just as you're saying, in terms of being able to catch, whoever is able to catch the eye of the presiding officer in the circumstances. And he started to accuse the presiding officer of not looking in his direction intentionally. How does one respond to that in the circumstances of what applies in the House itself? So if for some reason, let's say, he might have used the argument to say that he couldn't get his buzzer pressed in, or whatever technical issues may have arisen, him making that kind of outburst or putting on the floor that I'm trying to get your attention, but you're not looking in my direction. How is that ultimately treated in the House?
But the thing about that is that I spoke about the literal taking of, in a literal sense, of the catching of the eye. The catching of the eye was long before there was technology. The presiding officer, and that is why the thing is clear, who catches the eye. He didn't say who indicates first. Everybody could be indicating that they want to speak, but any presiding officer doesn't have the ability to see everyone in that chamber at every second. And that is why the technology was introduced. So there's a panel in front, the panel lights. It's easy for the presiding officer to look down, see the light in the panel. And at no point did I hear the assemblyman indicate that he did press the button and stuff like that. Even if there was a technology problem, then by now there would have been some announcement, look, there was a technology problem. I'm saying it was unnecessary because, let's say, the technology was not working And the assemblyman clerk was the person who knob work. I don't know how that works. And Mr. Duke knob did not work. He indicated, listen, you didn't catch my eye. Your eye didn't catch me. And I want to speak. As I said, there was a maximum of 40 minutes that one could have waited and just speak at the next slot. Because by that time, everybody in the house would have known that I have indicated I want to speak, and therefore I'm in line to speak the next time. The next speaking slot will be mine. And so it was not necessary for the long challenge. Now, that being said, I also want to say this. I am not saying that a presiding officer has overarching power over everything and that they shouldn't be challenged. Surely, anybody who has followed my political career in the assembly knows that I have challenged many a presiding officer on many occasions.
That was the next question I was
Then,
coming to.
so
You are known for that.
if you go back into the Hansard of the assembly, some of the most profound challenges in the assembly to presiding officers was done by Ashworth. When one presiding officer said to me, I ruled, and I had to say, based on what? And she said, I'm the presiding officer. I said, no, the presiding officer ruled based on the standing order. I mean, that argument went on for about 15 good minutes. But one of the things that was clear, and I remember in that, Assemblyman Kwaku always reminds me of that. And I remember in that discussion, the presiding officer, in the exuberance of the moment, the presiding officer got to her feet. And I was still on my feet. And the president indicated to me, I am on my feet. Of course, that only means one thing. Once the presiding officer is on their feet, you have no choice but to take yours.
Yes.
As annoyed as I was, I apologized. I said, Madam Presiding Officer, I'm sorry. I sat down. She said what she had to say. Once she sat down, I got back up and continued the discussion. I mean, heated as it was. So I'm saying that even if the member would have felt aggrieved, once the presiding officer stands to her feet, you really don't have a choice except that you are begging a confrontation that you can't win. But to take your seat, it does not mean that you cannot rise after the presiding officer take her seat. It means that discussion could have gone on in a more orderly fashion. But once the presiding officer stands to their feet, regardless of who else is speaking, regardless of if it is their speaking time or not, that person, by the standing order, must take their seat, allow the presiding officer to rule, and then you can challenge a rule of the presiding officer at any time. But you cannot get involved in a shouting match across the floor with a presiding officer, with both of you being on your feet, without there being consequences.
So that was where I was going in terms of your, what you have put forward as challenges in the House. So the question is, Assemblyman Duke has raised concerns in relation to the fact that he's only, in his follow-up press conference, that he's only referred to by the presiding officer as Mr. Duke on most occasions and not Assemblyman Duke. There was an abuse of, in terms of the use of power. In fact, he even asked in the House whether he should get on the table, whether he should, bang the desk, etc., to get the attention of the presiding officer. And then we saw where the presiding officer would have taken and to utilize a ruling in the circumstances. The question is, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, according to the operations of the House and the authority of the presiding officer, would you describe that as acting within the ambit of, or was it in some instances could be described as an abuse of power in the circumstances?
What you saw happening on Thursday is that even after the presiding officer indicated to Assemblyman Duke on a number of occasions that he should take his seat, the Assemblyman continued to stand, challenge the presiding officer. The standing order is clear. Once the presiding officer gets to their feet, anyone else must, not should, must take their seat. As aggrieved as you are, as annoyed as you are, and as I said, I have had major arguments in the House. Major. I remember one time there was another argument where the presiding officer was not even speaking to me, but I was minority leader. He was Mr. Kwak, who got up on a point of order and indicated, Madam Presiding Officer, on a point of order, and the presiding officer, without hearing the point of order, got up and said, that is not a point of order. I mean, that caused me to spring to my feet and say, do you read minds? What is the point of order he was bringing? You did not ask him to present his point of order. That again caused other members of the majority to get involved, and we had a very healthy banter that went on for a while. But every time that the presiding officer got to her feet, all of us knew that there was no choice but to take your seat, because that is what creates order in the House. If that is not done, if everyone gets up and shouts across the floor, then there will be chaos in the House, because once you start allowing stuff to happen, then that becomes the norm. And as I said, it was unnecessary. What transpired eventually was probably the only outcome that one could have seen, because there was a clear indication that the assemblyman was refusing to take his seat while the presiding officer was on her feet. So something had to give. As either the presiding officer said, look, I am relenting and sitting, and that would have given up the authority of the chair, regardless of who is in the chair. Or the assemblyman would have said, listen, the standing order provides for whoever is on their feet cannot be standing at the same time with the presiding officer and he take his seat. Obviously, there was two very strong-headed people, and in a case like this, the only thing that wins out is going to be the rules of the House.
Thank you very much, the former minority leader Ashworth Jack, bringing some perspective as to what took place in the House on Thursday as it relates to the challenge between the presiding officer and Assemblyman Watson Duke. Of course, him asking to be escorted out of the House because of his the challenge that he posed to the presiding officer and the August House. Thank you so much, Mr. Jack, for your contribution this morning, for bringing some enlightenment, for bringing your perspective and also your experience as being a member also of that House, and presenting your own challenges, as it were, back then. Thank you so much for that perspective.
Thank you.
Bringing that to our viewers.
Thank you for having me, and let me apologize again for changing your name this morning.
we know you have it right by now. In fact, you will join us as we head on out to the break with our signature line to remind our viewers to share the life, share the life, share the life.